Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Reforged podcast. My name is Drew and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. Today's episode is going to look a little different than some of the episodes that we've done before. Today we're going to be having a more long-form discussion with one of my good friends, Evan. It's not going to be very structured or guided in any way. We're just going to start talking about some spiritual ideas that come to mind that we think are really interesting. I will say this episode gets pretty deep and unprofessionally so, might I add, but gets pretty deep into theology and different things. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more guided and applicable, then I'd recommend maybe checking out some of the other episodes that you might not have seen before. But if you're a follower of Christ that really likes getting into some of the deep theological stuff, hearing arguments for God, questioning how do we effectively represent God or describe God. There's some really good stuff, I think, in this episode that you might find really interesting. So I hope you enjoy. If you have any prayer requests, please feel free to drop those in the comment section of either the YouTube or the Spotify show. I'll be happy to read them, be praying for you about them, and I can also address them on the channel so that we can be praying as a community for one another. But thank you guys for your continued support and hope you enjoyed the episode. All right, today I'm going to be having a conversation with my good friend Evan. He's going to be talking about a couple different spiritual ideas. We're going to have a little discussion. We actually have no preparation or any idea what any of this is going to be.
Yep.
So, kind of some raw, unfiltered stuff. Neither of us is like theological expert or anything. So
I don't claim to be. Neither of us claim to be. We are not smart people in general. Um, but yeah, just gonna sit down and talk about God and Jesus and stuff. So it should be interesting.
Yeah, take it all with a grain of salt. If working out some complex ideas, we say something that seems backwards or asinine, but you know, um, it is what it is. I do actually have a segue to start. I
Okay.
have an idea. So,
Does it come with handlers? Is it one of them hoverboard things?
what?
Them hoverboard things like the segways.
Oh, well, this one's got handles because I need you to take it and drive it in your own direction, but it's kind
Okay.
of got a little lead up for you to
Oh, that was
grasp onto.
that was good. That was good off of a really cringe punt that I
Yeah,
came up with
yeah, it
on the
was.
spot.
All right, so my idea is this. It's really not my idea. It's an idea I'm taking from a quote from somebody else.
Okay.
A little guy you might have heard of. His name is C.S. Lewis.
I like C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, and I heard this little bit from the other day. They used it at the church service I was at.
Okay.
And so it's basically you do not relate as a human being to God in the same way that somebody on the first floor of a building would relate to someone on the second floor of the building. You don't understand or resonate with where they are and who they are simply by moving up a floor or changing your location upward. In the same way, like as humans, we can't just look up to the skies or look to the stars and understand and fully grasp who God is. The only way that we can actually fully grasp and understand who God um, is if God is written into our perspective, and so it's more akin to the way that we relate to God as humans is the way that Hamlet relates to Shakespeare. Hamlet is created by Shakespeare, and the entire events that conspire in the course of his life are determined by the script that Shakespeare wrote. But Hamlet can't simply relate to and witness Shakespeare by being a member of the play.
Mm-hmm.
He can notice that his situation may seem guided in some way, but he can't actually really know.
That'd be very meta.
He can't know Shakespeare to be
Right.
Shakespeare unless Shakespeare writes himself as a character into the story.
But Shakespeare would then be a character, wouldn't actually be Shakespeare.
Right. But the idea is,
But I understand that. I understand the point you're trying to make.
yes, the idea is in the same way God to be fully known and recognized by us has to actually write himself into our story from a human perspective, and that's where you come to the character of Christ. Is Christ is God inserting himself directly as not just the author of the story, but as a character in the story.
I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. I don't think I've heard it broken down exactly that way before. That's an interesting way to think about it, but I do like the analogy of you can't know the person on the second floor just because you moved up a floor. You have to actually put in like the effort to go and talk to them. You have to figure out what they like, what they don't like what their different relationships are, what they do for work, like what are some of the things they enjoy, those kinds of things. I think it's kind of the same thing with God. We don't, like you said, we don't become closer to God just because we like look up to the sky and you're like, oh yeah, God's up there somewhere. It's like that. Okay, well, what does that mean? You're just recognizing that he's there. That's not really a personal relationship with God. It's just acknowledgement that he exists. And while that's good, it's not, I think Christ makes it clear that's not how we're meant to interact with God. We're meant to have a personal relationship and it to be more than just, oh yeah, he's up there somewhere in the clouds. Which, I mean, we had a whole discussion about that the other night. I'm sure we'll hit that at some point. But yeah, I think that C.S. Lewis makes a very good metaphor there.
Well, and I liked what you said about the effort to getting to know people, and I hadn't thought of it necessarily that way, because the way that I interpreted it, and I think it was written, was saying more that you can get to know the person on the second floor of your building. It does require effort, as you noted, but like it's possible to do that because they are a human.
Right.
But the difference is that God is not human, and so just by simply being in the same place with him, we can't fully relate to him because we just he's so far above us.
Right, but
not physically, but
Right, but what makes it so cool in this entire great story that he wrote is that he did make himself human.
Right.
From Jesus, so that he could relate to us and that we could relate to him in that sense. And it's through Jesus we can develop that relationship with God, which I think it's cool from a writing perspective, but it's also cool just from a theological and like reality perspective. This all-powerful creator humbled himself down to our level so that we could have any chance of relating to him. And that's crazy to think about, because that would not be something you would expect an all-powerful being to do.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's so important, and I think that was the thing I want to get at, as we agreed on, I think is really the important takeaway from that kind of framing, is that we can never ascend to God's level. Like we can't meet him where he is and understand him. So what he does instead is he comes down to where we are.
Right. Well, if we could understand or get to God's level, he wouldn't be God, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right, because it's I hear this argument a lot, where it's like, oh well, when you die, we're gonna become like God. We're gonna have knowledge of everything in the universe. We're going to be all powerful. It's like no, you're not. It's like it's gonna be different than how it is right now when we're like alive in this earth, but it's not going to be like all-seeing omniscience, like shoot lightning bolts out of your fingertips. I don't know. Maybe it will be like that. I don't know. I don't think so though, because I think the closer you get to becoming like God, the less God is God, and I don't think that's a thing that can happen. So
yeah, I think something interesting we can get into is like the idea of, we're both coming from a Christian background, and I would argue that if you're not coming from a Christian background, it's more important to focus on the basics and how a Christian faith like would apply to your life. I think it's a bad idea if you're starting to become a believer, you're trying to become a believer, to get really into the weeds with all this deep theological stuff that we're going to talk about today, because in all honesty, like as much as it's interesting and fun to talk about, I would argue that it really, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't matter, or at least it matters significantly less than the basic idea of the gospel.
Well, yes, it matters less than the gospel, but I would counter that it's not unimportant.
No, not
to
at all.
consider. I'd say it has different application. I think is a better way
Yes.
of going about that.
Yeah, it's not crucial to the fundamental understanding what faith is. I think where it becomes really beneficial is for situations like this where you're already coming at it from a faith perspective and you're just learning more and thinking about more and questioning more. Like it's really beneficial to deepening your own personal understanding of faith. But you're already coming at it with that faith lens, I guess is I want to clarify. But
Yeah, I mean, you and I have been Christians like our entire lives.
yeah,
So I mean, we were lucky to be brought up in households like that,
extremely fortunate.
and there are people who aren't brought up like that and are actually brought up the opposite way, being taught there is no God, there is no hope, there's no meaning to life.
Yeah.
Life is what you make it, kind of thing. You give life its own meaning, and that's just they're being sold a lie. That's as bluntly as I can put it. They're being lied to.
Yeah.
Whether or not the people who are telling the lie know that they're lying, it's a lie. And I feel really, really bad for those people. But I almost admire the people who come to faith through that more than the people who come to faith through like family, because that their faith took way more effort to actually get to the point where they actually believe. And I think that develops a very strong faith because of the troubled journey they had to take to get there. The road was not paved for them. They had to forge their own trail.
Yeah, definitely. The adversity they had to overcome. Like you said, I mean, we're both fortunate just to be raised into Christianity, and of course, faith for anyone of any kind is going to have its struggles and challenges. But forging a road, especially when you have people in your life that are already on this road and they're helping lead you down it, is a lot easier than realizing that you've gone so far down the wrong road and having to turn around. And you don't just have to build a faith, but you have to also deconstruct everything that led you away from faith in the first place.
Right.
It's a unimaginably hard thing to do. So I too have a lot of admiration and respect for people that are able to accept and admit, hey, like I was wrong about this, and turn around. But I also think that speaks a lot to just the power of who God is, that he can be such an important part of our lives that that it's possible that someone would actually make that change too.
Right. And I think also another sticking point for a lot of people who have not yet come to Christ is I think there's like a negative stigma in society around the entire idea of Christianity, because as much as I hate to admit this, there are people who claim to be believers. I'm not entirely sure if they are. I'm sure there are some who genuinely do, but they act all holier than thou.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, you're going to hell for this, and I'm not, yada yada yada, all that, and that's just the wrong way of going about it. It's not. It's not how Christ teaches us to act, and I think for that reason, a lot of society views Christianity as sort of a, oh well, we're better than you mentality, and that's not what it really is the opposite. But the problem is a lot of people don't express it in the way it should be. The way I see Christianity, it's the recognition that you're a bad person, right? And you needed help to be saved. You needed Jesus. And I don't know where that got lost down the road, because I hardly hear that discussed anymore. And maybe I'm just not hearing from the right places, but I don't know. I feel like that social stigma does not necessarily help the cause.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think there's a lot of cases too where I think what it stems from is the fact that they're which we'll probably get into this too, but like morality is so deeply intertwined with faith, because as Christians we argue, and I think correctly so, that the only defendable origin of any sense of morality has to be from faith, because any other determination of like right and wrong just doesn't really make sense. It doesn't hold water, because eventually it kind of circles back to itself. And but so Christianity is the source of morality, and I think with that it's just become also as you mentioned, whether it's more prominent, less prominent in the past, future, certain people and not others, whatever it might be. But like, there's a group of Christians at some point where it became apparent to others that, like, well, this is like a moral high ground situation, and so
Right.
that's where that holier than thou kind of stuff comes in, and people seeing it not as people genuinely defending what they think is right and wrong, not from their own perspective, but from the perspective of their God. But instead, it became just defending whatever they may happen to do and attacking whatever anyone else might do. And I think it's weird because we have a two-pronged problem. We have a perception of the Christian church that we're these holy moral people that want to impose rules and regulations on
Right.
people and make their life hard,
I
but
mean,
at the same time our actual churches are really lax on things that are really important, and they don't do a whole lot of work to speak out against things that are really bad just because they're not socially popular.
yeah, I mean, we've had many, many discussions about that
Yeah.
issue in particular, but no, I agree, and it's also I think it's also a lot harder for people who aren't of faith because again of that social stigma that we're talking about, to acknowledge that, oh yeah, I'm not a good person. Well, maybe not a good person isn't the right way to phrase this. I think maybe broken would be.
Yes.
I'm a broken person, I think,
Mm-hmm.
is probably a better way of phrasing that. It's the acknowledgement. Oh, I'm a broken person. We're all broken people, but that doesn't mean there's no hope, right?
Right.
But I think people don't want to acknowledge that because there are some people from the faith who say, "Oh, well, I'm saved and you're not because you don't believe in God and you did this and yada yada yada." It's like that's not how it's supposed to work. So it becomes hard. I think harder for them to acknowledge that they're broken because they don't want to admit that those people are right in one respect of their opinion. They're not right in the respect of the holier than thou mentality, but they are right in the respect that you're like a broken person. But
Yeah.
they're also, I think, self-reflection is also an important part of faith, is the recognition that you yourself are a broken person and you did need to be saved. And I think a lot of people forget that part of it.
For sure. I think there's just such a wide array of places that people can be in with that faith journey as well, that also makes it harder to bridge, because a lot of times the labels are pretty generic and they're simplified to just like Christian, atheist, maybe skeptic, throw that in there.
Yeah.
But really there's so many different places you can be with that, because there's Christians that are genuine and passionate about their faith, and then there's also Christians that, um, to your point earlier, I don't know how genuine their faith really is, but I know there's a
Right.
lot of Christians that almost use their faith as a justification for their brokenness. They
Oh,
don't
yeah.
actually fix their brokenness. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, but it seems to always be guided more by personal motivations, like, what can Jesus do for me? Like,
Oh, yeah.
I'm gonna do this life change not because God is commanding me to or asking me to, but because I want to. And then you've got people that aren't of faith that maybe they do recognize their brokenness and they're looking for change, but Christianity isn't being effectively presented to them as like an answer to their qualms. There's people who are invested in their brokenness, they don't want to change. There's people who are broken and don't recognize their brokenness yet. There's all kinds of these different people, and it gets even more complicated because we can all be all of these kinds of people at different points in our life. So it's really hard to bridge it, because anyone can have kind of pretty much any standard or expectation of what one group is versus another.
Right. And that's again why I don't really consider myself like denominational. I'm a God-fearing Christian. Like that's because I read the Bible, I see what it says, I look at other parts of scripture, I see if it's consistent. I try and figure out how it's consistent, like if there's like different phrasings that are used and stuff, and that's how I go about it. So for that reason, like, and I've got my problems with denominations. I'm not going to go into those, but I feel like that just unnecessarily divides Christ's church
Mm-hmm.
in some respects, and I understand the reasons some of them exist, and they're valid reasons. I myself am just not a fan of subscribing to one denomination and sticking
Yeah.
to it and not even considering anything else from
Yeah,
any
that's
of
fair.
the others.
For sure. I think that's good too. Good approach, because there's a lot of times we can learn a lot about our own faith from those that we may even disagree with about something.
Oh
Um,
yeah. I mean, there have been atheists or like skeptics who have come to me with like these really good questions, and I sit there and I these are humbling moments for me because I sometimes I fall into the trap of thinking, oh, I'm gonna have an answer for this. I'm gonna bring this person to faith. I'm gonna be the person that really pushes them
mhm.
towards Christ, and it doesn't always work out that way,
No.
because I'm not that person. I'm not God. I can't force them to do that. That's gonna be on them. But I've had atheists and skeptics give me the craziest questions,
Yeah.
like actually really deep questions, and maybe we'll touch on those, but they have had me stumped for a while. I've thought about some of them a little bit more recently, and I do have, I think, okay answers to some of them. Maybe not perfect answers, but yeah, I don't know. I kind of want to talk to some of those people again and
Mhm.
give them those answers now. I
Yeah.
should do that next time I see them.
Yeah. No, it is, and it's something actually I was listening to a podcast earlier today when I was out and about. Um, I was listening to a episode of "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist."
Oh yeah, Frank Turek.
But yeah, Dr. Frank Turek.
Love Frank Turek.
He's a great guy. So this is not sponsored, by the way, but no, I was
We're
listening to that.
sponsored by Jesus. That's
Yeah,
it.
that's true. I think it'd be good at the end of the day if we all were.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah, all our lives would be a lot better, fix a lot of problems.
but yeah, I was listening to an episode of that, and he was answering some other questions that people had asked him, and one of them was kind of similar, one of those like complex questions, um, and it was like it wasn't even being, it was a genuine question. It wasn't being critical or trying to stump anyone. Like sometimes I think you can get asked a question, particularly in some kind of like a debate or argumentative setting where the question is framed in a way where it's meant to be unanswerable. But other times you get a genuine
Right.
question. This was a genuine question. This was like accepting the situation. It wasn't like questioning anything but the sole question of the question. Like there was just whatever the
The
rest.
underlying
The
nature of the
yes,
question.
yeah, the
Okay.
premise was solid, and the premise was like accepting God does know all events, but also that people have free will. So it wasn't a question of how do those two things coincide. Just accepting that coincides. Um, the question was, why does God make people that He knows are going to choose to ignore Him and to go to hell?
Mm,
That was a really good question. And
that is a good question, actually.
and I think the important big answer that needs to be put down first is like we don't understand why God does the things that He does.
If we could understand God's nature, he wouldn't be God. He would be a
Exactly.
process we could break down.
Right. And God is like, I mean, you and I both, I think, agree on this that a lot of evidence for God can be determined by science, but you can't
Oh yeah,
prove God with science, and
you
that's
can't.
by design.
You have to go into almost philosophical arguments to even begin approaching proof of God. But even if you go down into like statistical probability of like the creation event and stuff, it leans pretty heavily in God's favor. But that's besides the point.
Right.
You were saying something. Go ahead.
Yes. And so that's like the big answer is always going to come back to that. It's like we trust God in that, and God knows why. But something interesting that you said that reminded me of part of the response to that was like, you know, God can do a lot of good through people who aren't necessarily intending to serve Him.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, a great example of that is obviously biblically the story of Joseph and his brothers. selling him into slavery. He gets falsely
Yeah.
accused of rape by Potiphar's wife, ends up in jail.
I like how the Bible didn't even think it was important enough to actually give Potiphar's wife a name. It's just called Potiphar's wife because they're
Yep.
not going to give her the respect.
Well, they didn't even give Pharaoh a
that-
name too.
That's true.
which is
Well,
also-
Pharaoh. Well, see, here's what's interesting is that
but the
I've
first
actually
Pharaoh
I've
was-
actually seen this misunderstanding, believe it or not, and I understand why. Is because people aren't familiar with like ancient titles. But Pharaoh was not a name; it was a
It's a title.
it's a title. It's like Caesar, right?
Yeah.
And this, so I've had people be confused, and it's like, oh, but there's like a huge gap between these two periods of Joseph and Moses. Why did this guy change?
It's
So
a
I'm like,
different Pharaoh.
it's not the same person.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Anyway, but yeah, that's a great example of people working with their own agendas and evil intentions, and God actually using that to work out a very good thing, and saving a lot of people. And so,
became
and
a ruler over Egypt from that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's pretty good. I mean, didn't he save Egypt from a famine too?
yeah, he did.
Yeah.
He did do
That-
that.
So again, that's more good that
Yeah.
came from that. Egypt would have died out from a famine. Joseph's brothers not tried to sell him into slavery.
Right. So that's the proof that, God can work good things from evil. And
Right.
to assume that everyone who isn't a non-believer is like, malicious is not true.
That's a ridiculous
But-
idea.
But the point is that God can work, and this is actually coming from, so I'm going to school for engineering. This is coming from an engineering perspective, where in engineering, like when you're designing something, you prepare for the worst possible set of circumstances so that it works in every other circumstance.
Anything
so-
that can go wrong will go
Right.
wrong.
So if God can use like inherently malicious and self-driven circumstances to work good, then of course when someone is just innocently, well, maybe innocently is not the right word, but non-maliciously ignoring God, then it's like he can use that too.
Sure. I mean, God can realistically use anything.
Yeah, and then going to modern day, you've got cases where, which is exactly what you were saying, is if an atheist creates an argument against God, like that can actually motivate someone who's a Christian to grow deeper in their faith because they want to have a good answer or response to that.
Right. But also some of these questions are not easy questions to answer. They do require sometimes being in the faith for a while, or like at least some understanding
Right.
of faith. I mean, you've got the ancient like rock analogy, right? We were talking about this a few days ago, where the question is, can God create a rock that is so hefty that he can't lift it?
Right.
And did I say hefty instead of heavy? I
Yeah.
think I accidentally said hefty. Okay.
But
Can
the
God,
answer is
and people will always look for a yes or no answer to this, but the problem is that if you answer yes or no, it's a paradox, because if God can't create a rock that's so heavy he can't lift it, then that means he's not all powerful. But if he can create a rock that's so heavy he can't lift it, that means he's just created something that he cannot do. And that's a flaw. So I will hopefully solve this quandary once and for all,
Forever.
because it misunderstands the nature of God. The question itself is a flawed premise. The question, it doesn't have a yes or no answer. The answer to the question is, why would he even do that?
Yeah.
I mean, like that's it, like God doesn't test his power. Like he doesn't have to. He already knows his power, and he's not gonna toy with logic and reality to just test it. Like it doesn't make any sense. Why would he do that? So
Yeah. Well,
the question isn't whether or not it's possible. It's the question. It's like there's no reason for him to do that.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to get to. So I'm glad it came up, and yeah, I thought our conversation was interesting about that, and I thought it was funny because like the answer to that question, and any question like it, is pretty much like, not like not trying to just not to be dismissive, but like legitimately the question is, that's kind of a stupid the question. The answer to that is, it's kind of a stupid question because it just
Right.
wouldn't.
Well, it subscribes God to having some semblance of mortal logic in existence, and that's just not how God works.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, God doesn't even exist within time. He created time. You can't exist in something that you've created, like, and have the same origin point as that thing. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. So it's like, can the being made out of rocks have created rocks? No, it can't, because that would mean that rocks already existed. So
Yeah, it's like you get wood from a tree, but a tree isn't wooden because
right.
you're fashioning wood out of the tree. Yeah, and we talked about that a lot, where it's like a question like that. I think just like the approach is flawed because the approach is assuming like you're like you said you're prescribing God and restraining him to mortal logic,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like do you really think that one that God needs to, or one that God would, or that God should like have this weird logical test?
I mean, it even says in the Bible, "Do not put do not put the Lord your God to the test."
Yeah.
I mean, like the premise of the question defies the very nature of faith,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it goes so against every single doctrine that's in Scripture that it like boggles the mind that this is even a question that people like. I understand why people struggle with that question, and I struggled with that question for a little bit, but I kind of thought about it for like 10 seconds and was like, oh, okay, well, this question doesn't make any sense.
So. Right. And it's funny that we can ask a question that doesn't make sense from our perspective, because it's of course from God that we actually have any gift of consciousness at all, and that we can, even in this very limited sense in comparison to him, like consider these things at all. Which like I almost think like the more interesting thing is the fact, like the more interesting thing to consider is the fact that we can ask a question like that of God and then like think about it for just a second and be like, actually that's a really dumb question, because I mean, for one thing, it's something that we couldn't do, which doesn't say much though, because God can handle and do a lot of things that we can't do.
Right. I mean,
but
that's what makes him God.
I think at the very least, then that should mean that we shouldn't be like, if we ask a question that is like one of these impossible questions, like from the very start, like the only thing we should be looking for is we should be very impressed if it's something that we can't do, that we're asking of God and that God can do. We should be very impressed and awestruck by his power, but we should never have a situation where if the answer is he isn't going to do this thing, because I won't say he can't, I just say he isn't going to do this thing.
Right.
And technically he can't, because like you said, it'd be a contradiction of who he is, but it's like getting into the cans and shouldn'ts and the doesn'ts of God is very complex, because the limitations that God has aren't really limitations. Like that's a very human idea of limitations.
Well, I think any idea that we can attribute to God is not necessarily in line. Like, I don't think that there are words to describe the nature of God. We just have to come up with words, because again, God created language, he created ideas, he created logic, created all of these different things. These things did not exist before God spoke them into existence. So if we try and attribute those things to God, they're a mortal communication method. It's not actually the nature of God.
Exactly.
Right. It's something that's kind of on the right track, but it's not the complete idea. Like, God is graceful, right? That doesn't accurately describe everything, but it's as close as we can realistically get. So yeah.
And I mean, to your point earlier, like we can't fully effectively communicate an idea that encompasses the totality of who God is, because then that means that we could fully understand who God is, in which case God would not be very much God anymore.
It puts God into a box, right? A box that you can like carry around in your pocket or something and just pull out. It's like, you see all of these attributes? Yeah, this is God. I understand him completely. And if you understand God completely, again, not God.
Yeah. I like to think all the ways that we define God are less like a dictionary and more like a thesaurus.
I think that's a great way of phrasing it.
Where you're kind of like, you can't actually define this thing that God is, but you can kind of look in the similar-ish words, and it'll be kind of like how if you're looking at, like, I don't know, similarities, like what's some synonyms for like, I don't know, like awesome? And it's just like
Cool.
there's varying degrees of like
Yeah.
how close the word really is. Like yeah, like cool is more like that's
Well, it depends on which version of awesome you're talking about.
yeah. I mean it's like well that's like kind of similar, but like that's less impressive, and that's kind of like the same way with all of our words.
Impressive is another
It's kind of like
synonym.
the same way with all of our words. Is we're like the words that we use to define God are like not they're not really that accurate in totality. They're not really they're just not strong enough almost really.
They come from a humanistic perspective. Like
Yeah.
we're not God. We don't have the the capacity to grasp everything that he is and like what his nature is.
Right.
So we have to come up with ways that we can define it and we can understand. So that's why it feels almost like a weak description.
Yeah.
Because it is a weak description.
It is a weak description.
That's exactly what it is.
But so, yeah, it's like getting like the main point across, even if it's not in intensity.
Yeah.
But so anyway, with that, it's like I don't think that we should be going back to the original point, circling back is like I don't think we should be all that I don't think it's a discredit to God when we ask a stupid question and realize that we can't come up with a compelling answer to it. Like it's not like God should be expected to fit into a weird, bad framework. Like back to the rock question, like because the answer to the question isn't yes, that doesn't mean that God is somehow
no.
less powerful. Like that the answer is no. Yeah. I don't know how to effectively explain that,
but basically, what I think I understand what you're trying to say, because the very nature of those questions puts God into a flawed description of sorts. Yeah. It does not accurately, or rather closer to accurately, capture the essence of God or God's nature, and we can't accurately depict God or understand his nature. I think we can get pretty close to some degree, but we're not quite there.
Yeah. I think it's good to say that.
Now, what I do think we can understand about God is what he says is right and wrong. I think that's very much something that he makes clear throughout Scripture. And this is, again, Frank Turek is great. The morality argument, I think, is one of the strongest proofs for God, or rather, it gets close to approaching proof for God, because there can't be any morality without God.
So, there just can't. Yeah, I mean, there's no way that there can be. I know. If you work at it from any angle other than God, it just doesn't work, because if you say that it's biological, then that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because there's really no if the point of if the biological purpose of humanity is to preserve itself, is to repopulate and survive, then there's really actually no incentive to morality.
It's because it begs the question, okay, why is repopulation a good thing?
Yeah, it's
again it uses that word good.
Because the word, like the morality of the purpose, because I think that's another important thing, is that I think for Christians, like purpose and morality are deeply intertwined.
Oh, of course.
And for no other argument is that effectively done, but everyone does recognize as a human that everyone recognizes, whether they choose to actually follow it or not, like there is an idea of morality. It's just why the argument, like the question in the argument being, why is that a good thing? No one ever objects to the premise of it doesn't matter. At least I've never heard anyone really, definitely not in an effective way, but really at all, ever try to argue that what's good and bad just doesn't matter.
Because that's a ridiculous position to have, because society would collapse if there was no distinction between right and wrong. There wouldn't be a society. There wouldn't be a human race.
It would lawlessness individuals. Yeah.
It would cave in. It would implode on itself.
Yeah.
I think is the best way of describing that. But you can't attribute morality to anything except for God. I've seen the evolution argument for the repopulation. I've seen, it's something society comes up with. Oh, okay, well, society's been wrong about tons of stuff.
Yeah, we've got slavery, we've got the Holocaust.
Oh, yeah.
We still have a ton of, sex trafficking. And
yeah, and it's, it just doesn't make sense to come from humanity or humanistic perspective. Now, this is one that I heard recently in my my philosophy class, and this is no disrespect to my philosophy professor, but I think my philosophy professor completely missed the point. It was we were doing a reading of Euthyphro, which is one of Plato's writings, and in Euthyphro, there are two characters. This is a dialogue. It's a fictional dialogue, but it uses Socrates, who was a real person, as a character. Because Plato was one of Socrates' students, that means Plato can more accurately write what Socrates' thoughts on this topic would have been before, he was executed. Yeah. So that obviously Socrates was not there to write his own opinions.
No kidding.
That would be kind of crazy. But yeah, so the whole dialogue is considering the nature of piety and stuff. But piety, it raises this thing called the Euthyphro dilemma, I believe is what it's called. The Euthyphro dilemma is basically, is something good because it is pleasing to the gods, or are the gods pleased by something because it is good? So again, we can substitute the gods for God, right? So is something pleasing to God because it is good, or is something good because it is pleasing to God? Or maybe I just said the same thing twice. I don't know. But yeah, that's the Euthyphro dilemma. Is that whole concept of pleasing God. And in the story, what makes it interesting is that Socrates and Euthyphro are both at that courthouse, that they're outside of having this dialogue. In relation to things about piety, and you get all sorts of concepts from this. Euthyphro's a lawyer. He's trying to prosecute his own father in a murder trial, which is seen as impious by Greek society, and Socrates is there to answer a charge of impiety. And Euthyphro approaches this discussion as an expert on piety because he's a supposed prophet of sorts for Greek religion. And Socrates assumes the role of a student during this dialogue, even though the irony of it, and this is why it's called Socratic irony, is that he really is the expert, but he pretends he's not in order to more thoroughly have a discussion on it. But this is a discussion for another time. It's a very interesting piece of writing, but but this is the moral argument, right? Is something good because God says it is, or does something make God happy because it is good inherently? And the point that I made when I was writing my essay on this was that something is good because God says it's good.
Yes.
Right? Because God created the concept of morality. In ways, and the reason he created the concept of morality is because he wanted us to live the best life that we possibly could. So these are the outlines, these are the guidelines with your free will that you should follow if you would like to live a good life. And again, there's that word good, originating from God. But the point that my philosophy professor tried to make was, after I had written this essay and turned it in, and he gave me full credit for it, so it was fine. But he said, this is a concept that people of faith are still struggling with. Don't worry, we're going to go over this in a future lecture. And I kind of sat there, and I was like, I don't think I'm struggling with this. I think I gave a pretty good answer, but let's hear what you have to say. And then I watched the video of that lecture where he talks about it, and he says, well, Socrates makes the case that piety and morality have its basis in justice. And I kind of sat there for a few seconds, and I paused the video. I kind of stared at my screen for a minute, and I kind of pondered this. It was very it was kind of theatrical the way I did it, but I kind of sat there for a few minutes, and I kind of thought about it, and I said aloud, but professor, what is justice designed to do? That's right, it's designed to determine right and wrong. So it can't be the origin
Yeah.
of right and wrong, because it needs right and wrong to function. Because it assumes that there are good and evil things in the world, and then it makes determinations as to whether or not a thing that was done is good or evil based on those originations. It's not the origin point. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's circular logic.
Yeah.
I wish I'd said something to the professor. I'd sent him like an email or something about it, but I mean, it wouldn't have done anything. It wouldn't have served any real purpose other than to just, speak that idea. But I sat there and it's like, the world has such a complete misunderstanding of where morality comes from. It just, it's a really simple answer, and people, I guess, just don't understand it.
Yeah, and I think it's really not helpful to that for so many people. The idea of morality is whatever I kind of just think is good, and I think it's good because either it concerns me in a way that it makes me happy, or doesn't concern me, so I don't really care.
Right.
And there's a lot of situations where you got tons of stuff like like issues like abortion or like transgenderism or gay marriage, where a lot of times people are just saying like, well, this is a good thing that we have these things, we should have them. And it's like, and the question, which is this from Dr. Turek says a lot, is the question whenever you have something where you're arguing goodness or morality, the first question is always by what standard? And the standard is like, well, like, just like, how is it not a good thing? Like, it's just a good thing because people want to do it. And I'm like, that's a really bad argument.
People
because
wanted to use leeches in medical treatments in medieval times. That doesn't mean it was a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, when we talked about the Holocaust and slavery and like all these bad things that
It's
have
like,
happened
yeah,
and do
slavery.
happen.
Oh yeah, that seems like a great idea. It's like, why? I don't understand how people thought that was a good idea, and I don't think I ever will. And I'm not gonna trouble myself with that question. But the entire problem of it is that it assumes that there is a good and a bad, but it doesn't assume an origin point. It
Yeah.
just it accepts these as like immutable laws of nature or something, and that doesn't make any sense the more you think about it, because then it's a completely arbitrary conclusion, has no real weight, and doesn't serve a purpose.
But clearly in our society we put a lot of weight and purpose in things like justice, which evaluate that. But I digress.
Well, justice is important because I mean that in and of itself is a moral idea. The idea of just not necessarily a justice system, but the idea of justice
being
right.
of justice being a value. Like actually the very word like value system implies that value. So like
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, to that point, it's like without having God to have this moral standard, to be this source of morality for you, how do you determine what actually, because like and people always go like, well, like, obviously not. I'm like, well, yeah, obviously not, but I'm trying to point out to you and make you think like, why obviously not? But obviously, like, slavery is a bad thing, and so when you tell someone that's something that they think is a good thing, like let's say I'm questioning someone about why they support like legal gay marriage and stuff, and they're like, well, it's a good thing. And it's like, why? It's like because people want to do it now, they can. And like there's actual like political argument to be there, but if you're just looking from like the argument of pure morality, is like, well, how is it good just because someone wants to do it? You say like people wanted to, if someone wants to kill someone, we say that's illegal. You say you can't do
Right.
that. And it's like, well, like, why is there any difference between, like, if the determining factor of morality is what people want, then how come sometimes what people want is bad and sometimes it's good? The answer is that's not really the standard. But they don't have a name for the standard because they either refuse to name the standard, or they don't have one, or their standard is really stealing from God's standard without God.
Yeah, and I don't think that's something people do intentionally. I don't think people are looking at the standards.
I wouldn't
God
say that.
gives,
No, yeah.
and they're like, I'm gonna steal this and I'm gonna
Yeah.
use it for my own ideology. Like, that's not what people are doing. I think that people have an inherent recognition that's given by God, and whether or not they like to admit it, these are immutable laws of good and evil that God has prescribed to the world, and there are things we should follow. And I think that the very acknowledgement that there is good and evil is acknowledgement that there is a higher power that had to determine what good and evil were. So, yeah. I
For
mean,
sure.
I know that that's a really roundabout way of saying things are bad and things are good, but it's it's an important distinction to make because a lot of people make moral arguments without having an origin point or a stand like an immutable standard, and there's just like this arbitrary definition of, oh, I like this so it's good.
Yeah, and I think maybe this, what I'm about to say, is just a reframing of something that you were getting at earlier. But, like, we don't actually always necessarily understand the standard of morality that we live by. We don't necessarily understand. Like, sometimes it's fairly obvious, like not killing people seems to
Right.
be a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
But there are obviously things where, especially with, and this obviously in some cases does, in some cases doesn't apply anymore. But especially if you look at Old Testament law, like things they weren't allowed to eat or do.
Right.
Like it gets really specific in ways that like maybe we don't understand, but we can trust that God does. But all that is to say that regardless of where it comes from or why it comes from, like for the standard of morality to have any weight in an argument,
Mm-hmm.
like it has to mean something, and that means that its meaning has to be concrete. It can't be arbitrary. Yet so many, as to your point, so many argue a standard morality. I have to be right because this is a moral position, but the actual morality behind your position, that your evaluation, what does the word good really mean? If it doesn't really mean anything other than I think I'm right, and so I'm gonna say that it's good, is it's not really effective.
No, it's not. But you also there's this is probably gonna end up being a segue into a different topic. But you brought up a point about like the Old Testament covenant. I've heard a lot of like skeptics especially will point to the Old Testament laws and like, see, this means God is cruel, and that goes against the idea that like, why did he have all of these arbitrary positions? And I've seen also a lot of people mistake that as current law that God gives. Is like, oh, so you guys aren't allowed to eat certain meats and stuff. And I'm like, no, I chow down on bacon like every weekend. It's like that's not the law anymore. But I've seen people make that misattribution. It's like, oh well, if you didn't uphold these things, then you're not a good Christian. You're not a good believer or a good Christian. And it's like, no, that's just a misunderstanding of what it is. I think that's a point people miss, is that that's the old covenant, and I think the purpose of that old covenant was to demonstrate that there is an insurmountable gap between us and God that was created by the fall of man in Eden. But after Christ came down, there's the new covenant, and that's just accept this gift of mercy and forgiveness that Jesus is offering to you, and that's the new covenant. So the old covenant, you can completely throw that out the window. I mean, like, don't go and do bad.
Don't throw
Don't
your
go and
Bible out the window,
don't
please.
go and do immoral things, right? Like the Ten Commandments are still like good and stuff, and some of the laws that were given in that time are also good and moral things, but the point of that was to demonstrate that there is a huge, impossible to cross gap that Jesus needed to be the bridge between. So there's the new covenant now that we live by, and the old covenant you can leave behind to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be careful with how much
Oh, for sure.
one considers the Old Testament because
Well, the Old Testament's still important.
you're right, and as Jesus says, he came not to fulfill or not to break the covenant, not to throw it away or replace, but to fulfill it.
Right.
You know, and so um, I think what you can infer from that is that um, you know, the old covenant was essentially that, like, if you look, you read, is God is among the Israelite people, and he'll do so and make them prosperous so long as they follow him.
Mhm.
Like most people, they're pretty bad at that usually.
It didn't exactly do a great job.
So there's like lapses. And
How long did they have to wander the desert? Was it 50 years?
I think it was 40, but
Oh, 40.
like, yeah, like a long time. Moses kind of got the short end of the stick on that one, but
Talking about the stick, Moses, why'd you have to hit the rock? Just talk to the rock, man.
yeah, man, just ask God to open the rock and
No, just do what he said.
you know.
Like this is another thing that I see a lot is people are like, oh well, I don't want to do this thing because it's going to be perceived as stupid or wrong. It's like your creator and the creator of everything is telling you to do this thing. Just do it.
Personally, I think if the creator of stupid and wrong, like, that sounds bad. Let me rephrase that. If the creator of the people who determine what is stupid and wrong by some arbitrary metric tells you to do something, you do it anyway.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, Jonah ended up doing his task anyway. After
yeah,
being
yeah,
like a total buffoon.
Jonah's a great example of, like, if I really want you to do it, like, you don't have to, but
I'm going to try and steer you in the right direction.
Gonna happen, and I'm not gonna because there's stories where you learn where someone doesn't do something, but then someone else does.
Mm-hmm. It's gonna get done one way.
But then there's also a story of Jonah, which I think isn't there to say, like, if God wants you to do something, you're definitely gonna do it, like 100%, and he's gonna make it happen, because we've already learned, like, God doesn't do that. God
it might not be through you.
Suppress free will. He'll get his will done, and he's inviting you to be part of that. But what it does show is that, like, God also does value us deeply as individuals. So the fact that he didn't, and it's funny because the story of Jonah is sort of this bitter man that actually really never does find peace in doing the will of God.
Yeah.
He just literally sits under a tree and dies. But
Wait, is that what happens?
Yeah, he like literally just sulks, staring down in the land, and eventually he dies, and he's never happy about it. It's crazy, but
okay.
But God cares about you, so he won't give up on you. He won't give up on trying to ask you to do the right thing, to do what he wants you to do.
No, because there's never really, I guess there's never really a point where you're like too far gone for God.
No.
Which is
impressive.
There's always room to save, and again, by our humanistic perspective, that's hard for us to believe sometimes, especially with a lot of the very wicked things people can do. So, it's not a concept I think that we can grasp in its entirety, and I don't expect myself to grasp it because, again, I find that hard to believe sometimes. But that's just something that you gotta go with.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. There was something else I was thinking about, and well, I guess we've already kind of talked about it a lot, but just like the idea of, like, how we approach questions about God, I think, is important. Because we already talked about how, like, when you ask a question that's paradoxical in nature and from a human perspective, it's like
the flawed premise questions.
Yeah, it's not an effective question, because really, like, the only point of asking any question of God is to further our understanding of God. God isn't affected or impacted. It's not like when you're having a debate with someone, that's important that both people understand each other, and that when you question one another, you're like, that someone can ask a question and win. You're not, like, winning against God.
Yeah, it's like when, dude, the passion I see some people argue with over these things, it's like, and someone drops one of these paradoxical questions with the flawed premise, they're like, "Ha! Take that, guy!" It's like God's sitting there, and it's just like, I don't care.
Like, it's
like you didn't do anything to me.
It doesn't change much. Yeah. So I guess my point is like, you don't want to ask a question that is like, there are questions that you will ask that are hard to answer, but you don't want to ask a question for the sake of it being hard to answer.
Right.
Which is, I think, what those things are. But
you have to have the right intent when you're approaching that kind of thinking.
That's what I'm getting at. Is the intent has to be, like, learning and understanding, not winning, because
you can't win.
You can't
God.
do that.
You just can't. It's not possible.
So and also to that point, it's like, I don't know why you would want to win against God, rather than
if you could win
with God.
If you could win against God, you would be God.
Yeah.
then God would no longer be God. Again, I keep bringing up this God wouldn't be God if this, because I'm trying to establish this idea that there is a very, very large dichotomy between us as the creation and God as the creator. Because we think we are so powerful in our own little egos, right? And this is collective humanity. Humanity thinks itself so powerful that they blind themselves to the actual power that exists, like right there with them, right? And that other power is God. So I think to some degree we forget that we are not the most powerful things in existence. Sometimes it's very easy to forget that, I think. But
Like, let's put it this way, right? There's like what, like 8-9 billion people on this planet, right?
yeah.
And each of us thinks that we're the king of the world.
Yeah.
Okay, there's 9 billion of us. So
Is it 8.1 billion?
it's 8 or 9. I don't actually know.
I don't remember.
But my point is, there's a huge number of us, and as a species, we think that we're really powerful. But no one among us can actually comprehend the total number of our species either. Like you like the human mind can't actually. That's why we actually have words for numbers, is because we can't. We have to represent them because we can't comprehend them. Like, but to the point of
they're
billion,
abstract concepts.
Billion is so big that like you can reference it just knowing like there's other things that we've counted a billion of, but like in terms of like in your mind, like can you picture a billion things?
No.
No. I don't even know how much a billion is like inherently. Like obviously we have math. I could tell you how many, but like I don't know.
Can you tell me how much 2 is inherently?
No, that's a different question. But like even just accepting the labels, like I don't actually know like how many zeros goes on the end of a 1 to say it's a billion, like off the top of my head. Like I can't just like see that many things.
Right. I think it's is it? Yeah, I think it's 9 zeros.
Yeah. I think so. Well, yeah, because a million is 6. So a billion would be 9.
Right, well, this is an irrelevant. This is an irrelevant
objection. Irrelevant.
Yeah. But no, you bring up an interesting point about condensing things into like you have us as humans in order to function.
That's my point. The limits of like our comprehension are like
we have to make affordances.
And so for any of us to try to challenge anything about God is kind of silly.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, it's never gonna happen. But I've also seen the question of the question of like, oh, if we have free will, then how does God know everything that's gonna happen? And I've thought about that for a while, and that had me stumped for a while. Because can it truly be free will if it's all predetermined? And the answer I arrived at is yes, absolutely. Absolutely, it can all be predetermined and still be free will. And the reason why is because God doesn't exist within the same time stream that we do. God is set outside of time because God created time so that we could process the progression of events around us. So, and again, this is why I think that the world wasn't necessarily actually created in 7 literal days. I think that
I would agree with that.
Everything happened. I think the majority of scientists are right when they say it was over billions of years. But I think that again, we can't comprehend that. And it's like, oh, and then 2 billion years later, this ice age ended, and it's like, well, yeah, but that's not
in creation
conducive to a like a concise reading. The Bible would be like 30 times as long if it went through all of that.
I must say I'm a little bit disappointed that they didn't have Moses write a complete, markup of the entire Precambrian period or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but yeah, to that point too, also if you think about like the purpose different parts of the Bible were written, and like the creation narrative, it's very, there are parts of it that are literal. Like I don't think it's solely symbolic, but
no, absolutely not.
But I do think that there's a lot of symbolism and what I'll call human elements in them, because it's almost like it was written to help us humans from our understanding, to try to help us understand and feel like why God created the world and how he did. And it was also to that point of the representation of time. Well, it was written before the Gregorian calendar, so like 7 days doesn't necessarily even mean a week. um,
Right.
right? It's like it does in today's context, but back then I don't think it did, so I don't really know. And also same with the stories, like um, when the story first came out, like math in the way that in the way that science is like a huge thing now, like it really wasn't there. Also,
Mm-hmm.
so like having that idea of like 2 billion years, um, human beings didn't have any knowledge of, or didn't really care, to be honest, either, like how much time had passed since the world came to be and whatnot. They were more concerned with more basic things than.
Right. The reason I bring any of this up with um going back to free will
Yeah.
and fate, um I don't think fate exists in the sense that, oh well, you're going to do this thing no matter what happens. It's like, no, you still have free choices that you're making. God just knows what they're going to be. And that's not necessarily fate. It's just the fact that God exists in eternity as a concept. And eternity as a concept is a crazy thing to think about because there's no beginning and there's no end. Right? Because God
Yeah, you like
has
literally can't comprehend the idea.
no.
It doesn't fit in your brain because your brain has a finite capacity. It's just like how we can't measure infinity.
Right. Infinity times two is still infinity. Infinity
Yeah.
divided by two is still infinity. Infinity minus infinity is still
Which, by the
infinity.
way, makes calculus a nightmare.
Yeah, I could never understand calculus. I only made it through pre-calc. But regardless, yeah, once you reach the concept of eternity, here's the crazy thing. In in God's perspective, from what I can understand it, and I can't understand it all that well, admittedly, the universe is yet to be created, is currently being created, and has already been created all in the same instant. From the concept of eternity, because there's no beginning, middle, or end, there's no perception of time at all. There's no sequence of events. It's all just like one. It's very hard to phrase in words, but
Yeah, because you can't even say
it's all
like.
simultaneous.
Yeah, yeah.
I think is the best way. So I'm again.
Which is still defining it in terms of time.
I know
Because
I'm
we can't.
simultaneous.
Yeah.
I'm simultaneously yet to be born, alive, and dead.
Yeah.
Like that. Like that's it's crazy. Like what kind of a crazy concept is that? But of course, it's crazy because it's God. God is crazy as a concept because he defies all logical reality because he had to create logical reality.
Mm-hmm.
So, like again, it makes sense, but it doesn't make any sense at the same time, and I think that's true with a lot of these things with God.
Yeah. I mean, too. One thing I'm thinking about is gosh, I have my train of thought, and then I was, yeah, just thinking about your thing, kind of blows my mind. But it's funny because one thing I did when I was younger was I tried to imagine what it would be like to not exist, and
Oh,
I found that
you're
it's,
reawakening a lot of
yeah,
sleepless nights.
exactly, yeah. I found that it's impossible, which should be obvious,
Mm-hmm.
to imagine not existing, because the very act of imagining it requires your constant, like
Mm-hmm.
you aren't capable, like if you didn't exist you wouldn't be capable of experiencing non-existence.
Mm-hmm.
So
You're talking about Descartes,
yeah,
cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am.
yeah, and like as simple as that might seem, like it's very much
It's a
true.
deep concept
It's very much true.
for
I
its
think
simplicity, at least.
if you take it to the point where you try to say I think I am a thing, therefore I am a thing, like um if you're trying to like justify things about yourself with it, you get a little iffy. Like if
Yeah.
but the very like for what he intended, just the question of do I exist, it's a very good argument.
Yeah, and he goes further into it in his discourse on the method.
Yeah.
It has a really really long title. I don't remember everything is called. We just call it discourse on the method in the class I took. But we looked at it, and he makes the argument that God has to exist because of the fact that he can recognize his own imperfection. That means that there is a standard that he's holding himself to, because he recognizes that human beings and himself are flawed. So there has to be some existing thing that is perfect that you can hold it up against. And because that thing is perfect, that thing would not doubt its own existence. So therefore, the fact that he can even doubt his own existence proves that God has to exist, because there is a being that would not doubt that is perfect because he is imperfect. It's crazy logic, and I have no idea how he came up with it. But it works. It holds together so well.
Yeah, that kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, it's like, I read that the first time, and I was sitting at my computer because I was reading it on a PDF.
If I believe I am real, is because God has given me the ability to perceive I am real. If do not believe that I am real, there's a God who knows that I am wrong.
Yeah,
that's kind of crazy.
Did you just come up with that?
No, it's like I just was
that was
trying to like
the paraphrasing
summarize in my head what he just.
The paraphrasing sounded deep, man.
Yeah, no, that's cool. But
it's an interesting read, yeah. And again, he goes through a process of some point where he's like questioning literally everything in existence. He has to make certain affordances in order to function in it. Like he sticks with like his Catholic faith and stuff. But,
I feel like it's
an interesting read.
And I know there's people that believe it, but I think it's almost stupid. Like even outside the question of does guys, I think the question of like does anything exist? Like are things real? Is like a really weird and stupid question, because I don't know if I'd say it's self-defeating, but if the answer to your question is anything real, if the answer is no, it doesn't even matter that you answered the question.
Right.
It's awfully sad.
You wouldn't even be able to ask the question.
It's awfully sad to think that, like, it's awfully morbid and sad to think that nothing would matter at all.
But you want to know something?
Because then questioning if anything matters at all. And also, I don't think anyone truly believes that either, too.
Well, no.
The people who say nothing matters.
Here's the thing, though. Some people genuinely do believe that. I'm going to counter you with this. Because atheists believe that there is nothing after you die. So the very fact of not existing anymore is a reality to them at that point.
Then why are they still driven to live?
That's exactly my point. Because I think that there is in every person some unconscious recognition that life is not meaningless. And that there is a purpose to life. They just don't know what it is, and they're being sold a lie that life is what you make it. Or anything like that. So I think that there is an inherent human instinct that God has built into us to recognize that we do have a purpose on this earth.
If life was what you made it, I don't know why there'd be limits on it, too.
Right. There would be no reason to set them. Because there would be no morality either.
Like, why... Like, if life is what I make it, then how come it ends? Like, why do I die without any say in it? You know?
But, I mean, even the fact...
And the other thing I actually want to bring up real quick, too, was... It goes back to the holes in like the whole argument, like, well, like, you know, human existence it's just scientific and biological and whatnot. It's like, well, if life is meaningless and after it you're dead, then it's all biological. There's already the question of like, then how come like we have a sense of morality when there's no reason to? How come we, especially how can we value people? Like, why do we care about people even when they're
stacks
dead?
Of meat.
Yeah, and like all that. But and so the entire purpose of humanity by this biological definition is just to repopulate itself.
That's called a virus, by the way. It's a parasite.
Exactly, because you're
literally mooching off of the earth.
You're mooching off the earth.
Multiply.
And you're just making more of your species for them to have the same fate of making more of their species and then dying and not existing. And there's no reason why. Like, the problem with that is that if on an individual level, members of the species just repopulate and then just die, so there's no like gain or benefit to them at all. Right. And then on a species level, like if you're just doomed to complete this cycle forever, like there's really no reason to do it. So in other words, your purpose is kind of purposeless.
Your purpose,
it just doesn't work.
Your purpose is to not have a purpose at that point.
Like, if your purpose is just to make more human beings that are going to suffer the same fate that you do.
Is that not cruel?
Yeah.
It would make humanity cruel. And humanity is cruel.
Actually...
That's the inherent nature of humanity after the fall of man. We're cruel.
a lot of people bring up that argument about childbirth is they'll say like, well,
I have heard
I
that.
don't want to
Yeah,
bring more, I don't bring a child in this terrible world. And it's like,
they'll
well,
use that as an abortion justification too.
yeah, and the reason that my perspective on this is different is because like I think there's more of a purpose to life than, well, nothing, I guess.
Right.
Because and so it's weird because it's these same people that would say that are the people that prescribe to this idea of the biological purpose and cycle of life. But um, it's interesting because they recognize how joyless and terrible their worldview is, but they don't recognize that their worldview is the cause of that, and that actually their worldview is incorrect.
Right.
They kind of just accept this dissonance that like I'm going to be a proponent of something that's absolutely
It's
terrible
like
for me.
it's like telling yourself there are no candy bars in the pantry, right? When there very clearly are. And then you become disappointed that there are no candy bars in the pantry, even though you just acknowledged that there were, but you decided to think that you weren't. It's like becoming mad at the world for there being no candy bars in the pantry when there are candy bars in the pantry.
Yeah, actually that's a
Like
great word. Yeah, it's like you're like where's like my incentive to make this worth
it's
it?
like it's right here. Like, you just told yourself that it didn't exist, and now you're mad about it.
But yeah, I mean, like, dude, we have all these drives, like, you know,
Or you want a better analogy? It's like throwing a baseball at a window and then being mad at the baseball when it breaks the glass instead of being mad at yourself for, oh, I did a really stupid thing by throwing a a rock solid object at a fragile material. I
yeah.
I think that's a good way of analogizing it, if that's even a word. I don't.
It's funny because I've always heard like the arguments like you throw a baseball at the window breaks, and get mad at the window for like stuff where it's like, you're trying to fight something that is there for a purpose.
Right, but
But in this case, it's the other way around. You're mad at yourself because you're the one who is, in this case, the window that you're breaking, is still would be the same thing, but it's putting the onus on you for breaking it for no good reason.
here's why I say you're being mad at the baseball instead of the window, because the window was already there. You brought the baseball with you. You brought your ideology with you, and you threw it at the world, and now you're mad
But it
at your
sucks.
ideology for it. Yeah, it's like
Okay, I get you there.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah,
That's funny.
I think. Well, it's sad too a little bit because you
Well,
see.
yeah, but it's funny in the way that you have to kind of think like it's a mute. Yeah, you got to be amused by something that is illogical and is depressing because
Yeah.
that's kind of actually, in my opinion, a lot of times when you laugh at something, that's a sign that it's foolish and silly, which is what would bring
Right.
that despair.
Yeah, but I think at the same time, it's you have to recognize that there are people that do live like that and they don't even realize it, and
Yeah.
that those are the people that need Christ the most. Is the people who think their ideology is right, recognize that their ideology is um very full of suffering. I guess is a good word for it. Subconsciously, right?
Yeah.
And then being mad at the world when their ideology doesn't work.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge contagion in society today, and it's important to call that out, because there is one ideology that has had staying power and does actually have its origins in God-given morality, and I mean that's Christianity. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
We've
you
already.
see how I circled back around like
Yeah,
that?
look at that.
It was crazy.
It's beautiful. We talked about a lot today. I want to talk about I think one last thing that's a little bit more structured.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to do this again at some point. I think it'd be great.
All right.
But I also don't want to have to edit too much. We have like already probably over, I think almost 2 hours of this, which is pretty awesome.
I think it's more like an hour and a half. But yeah, we're getting pretty close.
But I want to bring back a question that I had actually never thought about because, I mean, personally, like, again, this is one of those things I try to get at the start, which is like, sometimes you can focus on finding the meaning of the important thing, the reason that it's there, the kind of more basic fundamental Christian idea that you're given, or whatever it might be. or you can get really into the weeds once you've accepted that the value of whatever it is to be true. And so my example to kind of more clearly illustrate that, I never thought about this before, but in my Bible class in college, um, the question was brought up: is the story of Job, did it actually happen, or is it just kind of like an allegory? And it's interesting to think about because there are a lot of books in the Bible that are written more from a what we call like a wisdom perspective, where
Right.
it's not really truth spoken by God, but rather it's human knowledge surmised into statements that mostly hold to be true, kind of like as we got it earlier, things that are as close to the truth as we can possibly get.
Right.
It
I
doesn't
mean,
always hold true. There's counters. There's nuance to everything that we could possibly come up with, but you get the idea. It's like stuff like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes is more like it's less focused on God Himself, and it's more recognizing living in the world that God made. Like how do we do that right?
uh-huh. Yep.
And so the story of Job, I had never really thought about it being, you know, something that necessarily did really happen or something that's more theoretical, and meant to just express the idea of God's character.
Hmm.
But it's interesting to think about. So, ignoring, well, not ignoring, but already understanding the importance of the story, which we can actually talk about that too if you want, because the point of the book of Job is actually really cool too.
Yeah. But
But do you think it really happened or that it's more allegorical?
that's actually a really interesting question. I'm not I haven't really thought about it with the book of Job before. I've thought about it with a lot of things in scripture. Like I don't think hell is an actual physical reality that we're gonna exist in.
Hmm.
I think that hell is the opposite of whatever heaven or the new earth is gonna be uh, after Christ returns. And in order for that to be true, it's not going to be a physical reality because it's the absence of God, and God provides a physical reality.
Hmm.
Um, I think that it's going to be a conscious recognition of the soul that you made the wrong choice in life to some degree. And I don't know what form that will take, but I think it will very much not be a physical one. But I've also said this about the Garden of Eden, right? I don't think Eden was a place on the earth. I think Eden was earth at the
Right.
time. And the thing about the angel with the flaming sword is like symbolic of like the gap between between heaven and earth being created by the fall of man and our choice to defy God.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I have, and again, that's like the 7 days of creation. I don't think were 7 literal days. But the book of Job, that's an interesting one because I haven't really sat down and thought about it being a theoretical before. I've seen a lot of people say the book of Job is a demonstration of God's cruelty, but I mean, I disagree with that on a fundamental basis.
Yeah.
But I want to hear what you would think about it and give me like some reasoning behind it.
Well, first, I actually want to, even though I said maybe we'd circle to it, I guess I am going to start there. But um, the point you brought up, where some would say, like, the book of Job is God's cruelty exemplified or whatever, and
Right.
you disagree, I would also disagree with that.
Yeah, I don't think God is cruel. I don't think
I don't think
that's his
I don't
nature.
think
If
so
we can even
either.
call if we can even call it nature, and it's fine because again we can't attribute
Right.
anything from a mortal
But
perspective
for
to
the
God.
sake of being able to say anything at all, right? Yeah, I get what you
Okay,
mean.
for the sake of the
Right.
argument.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
But so, um, the point of the book of Job, right, is because like at the very end of the book, um, after Job asks to understand like why these things have befallen him,
Mm-hmm.
does God give him a clear answer?
No.
No, he just shows him like a bunch of stuff that absolutely blows Job's mind. Um, Shows him like everything, essentially, not even everything, but like to the human mind, right? Like there's a large amount of things that God is in control in, all of which like on an individual level, like we can't comprehend and we can't control. But then all together, especially like simultaneously, we could not be controlling our understanding. Like the stars in the sky and nature and things growing and rivers and all this crazy stuff. And from it, what Job does understand is the idea that um, it's not that we're not allowed to, but it's that when we question why God does things, we're probably not going to get an answer that we can particularly like or understand.
Yeah.
But what we can understand is that who God is, he is in control of all these things.
Yeah.
And he can handle all of these things.
That's the very concept of eternity on display.
And I think this is a great question for, although I'm full support of like the idea of science and trying to learn and understand as much of this world as we can.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great lesson to be learned for any scientist or academic or philosophy too. Like just whenever we're trying to broaden our understanding, we have to remember like we're trying to understand the character of God, and so the most important thing at the end of the day though is that our understanding helps us better accept who God is, and to trust him, because we won't ever fully understand anything to the point that we are capable of being at God's level, because as we brought up several times, wouldn't be God if we could be him.
Yeah.
And so like really the lesson is like just accepting that when God says he's working for good, even if it doesn't seem like it to us, there's so many other things at play.
Yeah.
That God ultimately is in control of these things.
And God works through tragedy too.
Right.
So
yeah, and I think another important thing too is to bring up like, which is why prosperity gospel sucks, is because Job isn't actually it's a lot of people read it as like Job loses all of his stuff and then he argues with God for a while, and then when he finally trusts God, he's given gifts and he's rewarded. It's actually not the case.
Can you define prosperity gospel real quick?
Yeah, well, prosperity gospel is like the idea that you join a church, and you give it a lot of money, and that means that God will bless you with a lot of money.
Okay.
So basically, by doing good, God will literally give you blessing, but blessing specifically means money. Which, because here's the thing, it is true that when you follow God and you're obedient to him, that you will be blessed, but it's not always, and actually it often isn't. It's often in many more ways than a financial sense.
It takes different forms,
and it's also not really a reward either. And that's part of the idea of Job, is that it's not like Job gets a prize for saying, you know what, God, I'm a trust in you or whatever. It's in the same way that we're given the gift of salvation through Christ. It's just a gracious gift that God gives to us because he loves us. And it's not something we earn. We should always be grateful for the gifts that we get, and we should always try to demonstrate our gratitude by being obedient to God. And it's oftentimes that our lives are more blessed. There is a correlation between how blessed we are and how obedient we are to God, but it's usually not because God is, again, specifically blessing us because we're obedient to him. It's more just like we're recognizing God's goodness because we're more in tune with him. And so there's truth to that.
It's more of a recognition of your blessings than actually being more blessed, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's already so many things that God does for you, is doing for you, will do for you, has done for you, etc.
Yeah.
And it's just the closer aligned you are with God, the more easy it is to recognize that. But going back to the base question, so that's like the importance of the Book of Job. But there's certain details in it that, again, I hadn't thought about before, and I don't know if I can really give a definite answer when I really think on it. But I guess the points that I think are interesting about it is, the character that is challenging God in the Book of Job is, we all
Job.
Well, no, not
is it Job.
The person who's challenging God to do this experiment with Job. It's actually
Satan.
It's actually not Satan.
Hmm?
Is the argument that I've heard, because the word that they use for Satan is not actually like Satan the devil. It's not the same.
Was it serpents or
no? It's the I don't remember what was it exactly. It was like the dissenter or something like that, where it was basically just the idea like he essentially it was an angel playing devil's advocate, which is another reason to believe that it might not be a literal story because you've got this story that's taking place in the court of God. Like God's up here, he's got all his angels, they're all worshiping him, and he's talking about how great Job is, and then one of the angels comes forward and says, I think Job is only good because you've blessed him, like because his life is good, he trusts in you. And this is another important reason to note that this is besides the literal argument. This is going back to the purpose of it. Another important reason to note why you're not blessed as a reward for following God, because then that would prove actually this archangel right. So in the translations of English, it translates it to Satan, but apparently in terms of Greek and stuff, it's like a different word. This is what I've been told.
Interesting.
And it's a word that wasn't typically used to define Satan, as far as I understood.
Okay.
Now I don't know this for myself because I don't know Greek. This is just
I
what
mean,
I
I
was
don't
told.
either. So.
But
I mean,
basically,
I can...
the title given to Satan, also the fact that Satan was still in the court of heaven, makes you think like, well, it's probably not a literal like God Satan conversation, and also with that comes the question is like, is it really like, is this angel that's questioning Job, is it like, is he really a force of evil because he's given permission by God to do this experiment, and God also typically doesn't test his followers in that way. There's a lot of logistical questions about how like the way that God acts and also the way that this opposing force act in this text are weird in the sense that there's kind of some holes with how their character align with how they would usually be.
Huh.
Like I guess there's inconsistencies, and this could just be because our understanding is limited, but there seems to be inconsistencies between God's character in the Bible and in Job.
Interesting.
Which leads you to believe that like maybe it's just written to be an experiment where, like all of the things that humans come up with, it's not going to be perfect.
Well, I mean, Song of Solomon isn't literal either, and I kind of wish I hadn't read that book. So I mean, I could see an argument being made for Job being more of a parable than an actual sort of like Euthyphro, where it takes an actual person and puts it in a fictional scenario.
Yeah. And I do want to clarify, of course, like it being literal or not, like does not change the message
matter.
Of the book at all. Like this is a question that like doesn't matter, like, to be honest, but it's just something interesting to think about.
It's not that the question doesn't matter. It's that the question seeks an answer to something that we're never going to realistically be able to fully discern.
It's more hypothetical in the sense that you're coming up with an answer that's not really guaranteed right or wrong.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have to do that. We have to.
It's a lot of things are.
We have to make affordances, like I've said a few times.
Sometimes.
Yeah, I've said it many times over the course of this.
Many a moon.
Yeah. I don't know how I feel about the story of Job being a parable. I can definitely see a case for it. It's something I would have to look
The other argument too is like chronologically it's placed, not that the Bible is really always in chronological order anyways, but it's just like its placement in the Bible is like it's hard to pin down when exactly that would have happened, and also like it definitely compared to whatever's surrounding it doesn't really make sense.
Okay.
So that was the other thing, was like when is this happening?
That is an interesting point to make. Because the Bible usually does follow like some sort of chronological sequence in some senses of it. I mean, you have the Gospels, which are telling the same story from different perspectives, that are all like right one after the other. But I mean,
or kind of all at the same time.
But yeah, but then all the books after that follow sort of a sequential manner.
Yeah,
at least from what I can remember. I could be totally wrong about that.
Well, and like I mean, there's like also stuff that just is anthology, like the
Yeah.
letters.
Well, I mean, you've got like Corinthians, and you've got
Yeah, the letters don't really.
yeah.
So it's it's strange, but I don't know. I just thought it'd be interesting. I didn't know if you'd ever thought of it before.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that specifically with the Book of Job. I've done that with a bunch of other stuff
Right.
in the Bible. I've just never really sat down and thought about Job, but that is something that would be interesting to look into a little bit more.
I think it's funny too because I mean, I guess there's our own understanding, but typically I think the thing that motivates us to answer these questions that, again, we're being careful with how we say don't matter, but in the sense of like our salvation don't matter.
Okay.
Like as long as we accept it to be true that, however it came to happen, that Christ is God, Christ came to earth, Christ died on the cross for our sins, Christ resurrected,
Right.
Christ is coming back, God is in control, etc. Like as long as we accept that, like we're saved.
Yeah.
But the reason we ask these questions is not because they matter to if we are Christians or not, but it's because in being Christians we're intrigued by this and we want to understand this more. And and typically too, the reason that we're asking these particular really interesting questions is because we're pitting ourselves up against people who are non-believers who for whatever reason think that all of these questions have to be answered
Right.
to accept to accept the truth of Christ. Like to be a believer of Christ and to accept him to be true, we have to know literally freaking everything. And it's funny because it's a contradiction because the person that they're literally talking to and asking these questions already doesn't know the exact answer. You can't know the exact answer. None of us can.
Yeah, and if you could understand God completely, he wouldn't be God.
Right.
I've said, how many times have I said that?
Multiple.
Yeah, many.
So it's like, it's funny because the people that they're asking those kinds of questions are in fact Christians who don't know the answer to that question. So they don't have to know the answer to that question to accept Christ to be true. But it really comes down to is like you're pitting someone who believes something and the evidence of the world supports that theory versus someone who believes something else. And in their case, the lack of evidence defeats something else.
Right.
Now, incidentally, usually the lack of evidence is less striking than the apparent evidence for this thing that they're trying to combat. But, again, there's hundreds of things we could talk about where it's like, wow, that's really cool. How can you not see God in that?
Yeah.
Something I'd love to talk about at some point is there's a book called Our Privileged World, and it's the idea that like Earth is literally like so conducive and perfect to life, which is something that many people brought up. But not only that,
oh yeah,
on top of it being conducive to life, it's also extremely conducive to science. Yeah. So it's not only conducive to something living there, but something living there that would be able to observe and understand what's happening around it. So
right.
That idea that like the fact that those two things coincide so perfectly, it's not coincidental.
No, I don't think it is. No.
Like the fact like, and for example, one thing they brought up was like the fact that perfect solar eclipses are only visible on Earth.
Yeah.
Like you can't see that anywhere. It's like the planet where people that could see that live is where that thing happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's very uniform. Like
if we were,
it's kind of taking. Have you ever heard like the finely tuned arguments?
Yes, I've heard the finely tuned.
Yeah, so those are great.
Because, like if Earth was an inch closer to the sun, we would all fry.
It's like pretty much every like use case where if something was slightly tweaked, like it'd be over.
Yeah.
It's taking that to the next level of saying like, well, not only that, but like these particular conditions and constants that we live with is like they're easily observable and you can find them and then you can use them to do science. Like the fact that it's not just the fact that our gravitational constant on Earth is conducive to us living, but it's the fact that the gravitational constant of Earth made it so that we could actually research and find the gravitational constant of Earth.
Yeah.
There's so many other factors on other planets where it's way harder to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, in a lot of cases, the only reason we can do it is because we can do it in proportion. Like we figure out the equation using the proportions of our planet, and we compare it to another planet, and that's how we figure it out.
Yeah.
You're like, well, like it's got to be the same with a different set of variables. That's how you solve, right? It's algebra, right? Just also something that we could figure out here, but like,
Yeah.
it's cool stuff like that, and I love talking.
Yeah. I've not really thought about like the it being conducive to science case before. I've heard the finely tuned arguments, and I think that's a very solid argument.
Yeah,
But I've never really thought of the you can do science here argument.
like the fact that we can understand it's finely tuned.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I mean, even understanding itself is proof of God. I
Um,
mean, that goes to Descartes.
but I guess that we can quantifiably in some cases.
Sure.
Right? Like God's given us the tool to kind of understand just how crazy it is we're here.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's just a sign that we were put here for a reason.
Yeah, I think that's a great argument.
Yep. Good stuff.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think we should probably close on that. We've been going at it for a bit, but
Yeah. How long has it been? Like 90 minutes?
it's been a long time.
Yeah.
God is cool, God's great.
Jesus and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. We
But
talked about we talked about a lot of things. Some was some of them were well phrased.
some of them probably weren't.
Others were not. There's other topics I wish we couldn't have gotten to as well, but hey, maybe some other
We'll do it again.
some other time if we do this again. Yeah.
Yeah, but thanks for being here. Thanks for doing this. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
for sure.
It's been good, and yeah, hope to have you on again.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode of the Reforged podcast. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. Follow the show on any platform that you'd like. We're on YouTube and we're on Spotify as of now. Hope that you enjoyed. Please share the show with your friends, family, coworkers, anyone that you think might benefit from hearing any of the content that we have here on the show. And once again, really appreciate all the support that you guys have been giving. It's by you sharing the show that this show's reach and its audience grows, so I really appreciate you for that. And I hope that we can continue to grow and come together as a community to honor God. Hope that you all have a blessed week as the holidays are coming up. I hope you all have a Merry Christmas, and I hope that you can all take some time with friends and with family to just really embrace the meaning of the season, to recognize the gift of Christ, and just to enjoy what He's given you. Hope you guys are blessed this week and have a great one. And remember, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another.